You hear footsteps above muffled voices, speaking words you can't quite make out. The lamp flickers, oil running low already. In the corner sits bread you cannot eat, water you cannot drink, because your throat has closed with terror. The earth presses in from all sides. You are 6 feet underground, in a chamber barely large enough to stand, and you are going to die here, slowly, alone, in absolute darkness. And the cruelest part, you wore white robes. You were sacred. You were one of the most powerful women in Rome. If that grabbed you, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I'm still amazed that stories varied for 2,000 years somehow find people across every continent. Rome, 114 BCE, the Republic was fracturing. Germanic tribes were slaughtering legions in the north. Political factions tore at each other in the Senate. The old certainties, the belief that Rome was eternal, blessed, invincible, were crumbling under the weight of military disasters and social upheaval. Citizens walked through the Forum Romanum with dread crawling up their spines, sensing something fundamentally wrong in the air itself. Then lightning struck. A young woman, daughter of a wealthy equestrian family, was killed instantly by a bolt from a clear sky. In Roman cosmology, lightning wasn't random. It was Jupiter speaking. It was divine rage made visible. It was a message that demanded interpretation. The haruspices priests who read omens in animal entrails and natural phenomena consulted their sacred texts and delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves through the city. The Vestal Virgins must be examined. Something was wrong with Rome's most sacred priestesses. Somewhere among the 6 women who tended the eternal flame, someone had broken her vow. Someone had polluted the city with sexual transgression, and until that pollution was purified through blood, Rome would continue to suffer. 3 names were spoken: Aemilia, Licinia, Marcia, all Vestal Virgins, all accused of incestum violation of their sacred chastity. The punishment, prescribed by tradition stretching back to Rome's founding, was ancient and absolute. They would be buried alive. But here's what makes this story far more disturbing than simple brutality. These women weren't helpless victims. They were among the most powerful people in Rome. They had legal rights that senators' wives could only dream of. They could own property without male guardians. Their word in court required no oath because they were assumed incapable of lying. Condemned criminals touched by their shadow received automatic pardons. They sat in the best seats at gladiatorial games, while patrician women sat behind them. They were extraordinary, untouchable, sacred, and Rome was about to bury them alive in holes in the ground. To understand how this happened, you need to understand what a Vestal Virgin actually was, and I promise it's nothing like what you've imagined. The order dated back to Rome's earliest days, established according to legend by King Numa Pompilius in the 8th century BCE. He created exactly 6 priestesses, never more, never fewer, whose sole sacred duty was maintaining the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. The fire could never go out. This wasn't superstition to Romans, this was material reality. The flame represented Rome's life force. If it died, Rome died. The survival of the greatest power on earth depended on 6 women keeping a fire burning year after year, generation after generation. But you couldn't just be anyone. The selection requirements were extraordinarily specific. Girls had to be between 6 and 10 years old, prepubescent, physically untouched, representing the perfect state before womanhood began. Both parents had to be alive, married, respectable. The girl herself had to be physically and mentally perfect. By Roman standards, no defects, no disabilities, no imperfections of any kind. 20 candidates would be presented to the Pontifex, Maximus, Rome's chief priest. He would choose one. The moment she was selected, something unprecedented happened. She was legally freed from her father's patria potestas, the absolute authority that governed every other Roman woman's entire life. She didn't transfer from father to husband as every other woman did. She became something unique in Roman law, a woman who belonged to no man. The ceremony that transformed her was carefully scripted. The Pontifex Maximus would take her hand and speak an ancient formula. I take you, Amata, to be a Vestal priestess, to perform the rites which it is lawful for a Vestal to perform on behalf of the Roman people, Amata beloved. Every Vestal was called this at her induction, regardless of her birth name. It was the first step in creating a new identity separate from family, belonging only to Vesta. Her hair would be styled in the semi-crines, 6 braids wound around her head, a style otherwise worn only by brides on their wedding day. This wasn't coincidence. A vestal occupied the liminal space that other women passed through quickly, the transition from daughter to wife. But a vestal stayed there forever, suspended between girlhood and womanhood, between family and family, belonging nowhere and everywhere at once. The commitment was 30 years, 10 years learning, 10 years serving, 10 years teaching the younger priestesses, 3 decades of absolute virginity. No marriage, no children, no normal life trajectory whatsoever. But in exchange, she received powers that were staggering. A vestal could own property in her own name. She could write her own will without male permission. These seem like small rights until you understand that every other Roman woman, every single one, regardless of wealth or status, needed a male guardian to conduct legal business. A senator's daughter couldn't sell property without her father's consent. A consul's wife couldn't sign a contract without her husband's approval. A vestal could do both at will. Vestals possessed sacrosanctus, the same legal protection as tribunes of the people. Strike a vestal, and you faced death. Insult one, and you committed sacrilege. When a vestal traveled through Rome's streets, she was preceded by a lictor, the same official who walked before magistrates, clearing the way and commanding respect. And here's something that still seems impossible. If a vestal accidentally encountered a condemned criminal being led to execution, that criminal was immediately freed. She didn't have to speak. She didn't have to do anything. Her mere presence was enough to overturn a death sentence. This wasn't courtesy. This was law. They stored wills of emperors. They witnessed treaties. They mediated between warring political factions who trusted no one else. In 143 BCE, a vestal named Claudia literally threw herself onto her relative's triumphal chariot when a tribune tried to stop it. The tribune couldn't touch her without committing a capital crime. The triumph proceeded. That was power real, tangible political power wielded by a woman in a society that gave women almost none. So, when I tell you that 3 vestals were accused of breaking their vows in 114 BCE, understand what was actually at stake. These weren't powerless girls. These were women who'd spent 15, 20, 25 years building influence, accumulating wealth, navigating Rome's political landscape with skill that would make senators jealous. They had survived in an institution that demanded perfection every single day for decades, and now they were being accused based on testimony from a slave. Think about that for a moment. In Roman law, slaves normally couldn't testify against free persons. Their word was legally meaningless. But in cases involving vestals, all normal rules were suspended. The pollution they supposedly caused was so dangerous that any evidence, no matter how tainted, could be considered. The case went before the Pontifical College, the Board of Priests, with jurisdiction over religious crimes. They investigated and reached a verdict. Aemilia was guilty. Licinia and Marcia were innocent. Aemilia was sentenced to death. She was dressed in burial clothes, placed on a covered litter like a corpse being carried to funerary, and transported through the forum in absolute silence. People parted before the litter without speaking. Inside, she couldn't see out. She could only hear footsteps. The terrible, suffocating silence of a city that had decided she must die. The litter carried her beyond the city walls to a place near the Porta Collina, where a small underground chamber had been prepared. Inside were a bed, a lamp with oil, a loaf of bread, water, and milk. Just enough, ancient writers noted, to absolve Romans of the charge of directly killing a sacred person. She was led down into the chamber. The entrance was sealed. Earth was heaped over it until no trace remained. Then everyone walked away. The Romans hadn't killed her, they told themselves. They'd simply placed her underground with provisions. What happened after that was between her and the gods. If she was truly innocent, the gods would save her. If guilty, divine judgment would take its course. But the crisis hadn't passed. The gods were still angry, anyone could see that. Military defeats continued. Political tensions escalated. Clearly, the Pontifical College had gotten it wrong. 2 guilty vestals were still walking free, still polluting the city with their presence. Popular pressure forced the Senate to do something extraordinary. They established a special court headed by Lucius Cassius Longinus to retry the case. This violated religious protocol entirely. The Pontifical College's jurisdiction was supposed to be absolute, but political necessity overrode sacred law. The special court reached a different verdict. All three Vestals were guilty. Licinia and Marcia joined Aemilia in death. They were buried alive in separate chambers, sealed underground with lamp and bread and water, left to die slowly in darkness. Their alleged lovers, young aristocrats named Lucius, Vittorius, and Marcus and Manius, Aemilius, were beaten to death in the Forum. Here's what you need to understand. There's no credible evidence any of these people were actually guilty. No witness testified to seeing them together in compromising situations. No one described specific sexual acts. The evidence consisted primarily of the fact that young men had visited the house of the Vestals, which happened constantly because Vestals conducted business, stored wills, mediated disputes, and that the Vestals had been seen talking with men at religious festivals, which was literally part of their ceremonial duties. They were convicted of being friendly, of being young women who interacted with young men in the normal course of their work. They were convicted because Rome needed scapegoats, because the gods needed appeasement, because the people needed to feel something was being done about the crisis consuming their world. The same privilege that gave Vestals power also made them perfect sacrifices when things went wrong. They were separate from normal society, liminal, ambiguous, neither fully women nor fully divine. When Rome needed someone to blame, someone whose death would carry sacred weight, Vestals were available, and it happened again and again. Throughout Roman history, in 216 BCE, after the catastrophic defeat at Cannae, when Hannibal slaughtered 50,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon, two Vestals named Opimia and Floronia were convicted of breaking their vows. One committed suicide. The other was buried alive. The military disaster demanded religious explanation, required purification, needed blood. In 73 BCE, a Vestal named Fabia was tried for incest. She was acquitted, but only after a traumatic trial that destroyed her reputation. The suspicion never fully lifted. For the rest of her life, people whispered, wondered, judged. In 90 CE, the Emperor Domitian became obsessed with restoring traditional Roman morality after years of perceived decline. He targeted the Vestals. Cornelia, the Virgo Maxima chief of the order, was accused without evidence and buried alive without even receiving a trial. 3 other Vestals were also convicted. Domitian graciously allowed them to choose their method of suicide rather than face burial. Notice the pattern. These trials cluster around moments of crisis, military defeat, political upheaval, transitions of power. Whenever Rome felt threatened, whenever the old order seemed to crumble, Vestals went on trial. Their guilt or innocence was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that they were ritually pure, set apart, and therefore effective sacrifices. Their deaths carried meaning, restored balance, proved that someone was taking action. The historian Holt Parker has argued that Vestals functioned as pharmakoi ritual scapegoats, whose deaths were meant to purify Rome and restore peace with the gods. And here's the cruelest irony. All those privileges I described, the legal rights, the political power, the wealth, the honor, all of that made them even more effective as scapegoats. The higher they stood, the more their fall meant. When an ordinary woman died, it didn't carry weight. But when a Vestal died, a woman who'd been set apart as sacred, who had power other women couldn't dream of, her death was a real sacrifice. Something genuinely valuable had been given up. The system created women with unprecedented privilege, specifically so that privilege could be taken away. When Rome needed a spectacle of purification, after 30 years, a Vestal was free. She could leave the house of the Vestals, marry if she chose, live the life other Roman women had lived decades earlier. But most didn't. We have records of retired Vestals, some married, though by then they were in their late 30s or 40s, past normal marriage age. Most remained single, living on accumulated wealth, existing in social categories Rome had no language for. There's a woman named Junia Torquata whose story haunts me. She served from around 30 CE to 60 CE through the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and into Nero's principate. She witnessed madness and cruelty and political chaos. She kept the sacred flame burning while the world descended into violence. She completed her service. She was free. And then we find inscriptions honoring her. Erected by family members, nephews, and great-nephews, she'd never really known grateful for the honor she'd brought, but treating her as curiosity. Relic, woman outside normal categories. She never married, she lived 20 more years after retirement, and was buried with honors. her tomb marked as that of a former Vestal. Even in death, that remained her primary identity, not daughter, not sister, not wife or mother. Vestal, forever defined by those 30 years. In 394 CE, the Christian Emperor Theodosius officially disbanded the Vestal Order. The sacred flame was extinguished after more than 1,000 years. The House of the Vestals was closed. The last 6 Vestals, their names lost to history, were pensioned off and sent to live private lives. Rome didn't fall. The eternal flame went out, and the city endured. The entire theological justification for the Vestals' existence, that Rome survived only because they kept the fire burning, was revealed to be myth. But for more than a millennium, generations of women had organized their entire lives around that myth, had given up marriage, family, children, had lived under constant threat of execution for violations they might never commit, had died in underground chambers, alone in darkness, sacrificed to gods who demanded nothing. What do we do with that knowledge? How do we honor women who found genuine purpose in their service while acknowledging the system that exploited them? How do we recognize their agency without erasing the constraints that could kill them at any moment? Amelia, buried alive for crimes she probably didn't commit. Licinia and Marcia, retried and executed when the first verdict didn't satisfy public bloodlust. Cornelia, killed by imperial paranoia without even a pretense of trial. Unia Torquata, who served faithfully for 30 years and lived 20 more as a respected but fundamentally displaced person. The unnamed last 6, who watched their order dissolved and their purpose declared irrelevant. They were Rome's most powerful women. They were Rome's most vulnerable women. They were both, and in that contradiction lies a truth about power, gender, and sacrifice that still echoes across to millennia. The House of the Vestals still stands in the Forum today. Tourists photographed the reflecting pool, the statue bases, the columns that once framed lives lived in service and terror. The sacred flame is gone, the rituals have ceased, but the space remains heavy with memory. Stand there long enough, and you can almost feel it, the weight of expectations impossible to meet. The privilege that doubled as target, the power that came wrapped in the constant threat of being buried alive for political convenience. You can almost hear footsteps on ancient stone, women moving between duty and death, never quite sure which would claim them first. The lamp ran out of oil first, ancient sources tell us. Then came the darkness, complete and absolute, and then, eventually, the silence.